last week, someone mentioned on my comments that I hadn't really talked about Robert Lowell much on this channel at all. Robert Lowell is one of the major poets of the mid 20th century in America. He fits into, broadly speaking, the confessional movement, of which Sylvia Plath we've talked about before. But he's one of these people who wrote confessional verse, that is, more free verse, more talking about one's inner struggles with mental health, opening about one's family trauma and personal dysfunction. But he goes beyond that. He was a writer who wrote in many different verse styles over the course of his life, including strictly metered early poetry, late sonnets. But in his middle period, in a collection called Life Studies, he wrote what were probably his most influential poems, and I want to share one of those with you today. This is called Skunk Hour for Elizabeth Bishop. Nautilus Island's hermit heiress still lives through winter in her Spartan cottage. Her sheep still graze above the sea. Her son's a bishop. Her farmer is first selectman in our village. She's in her dotage, thirsting for the hierarchic privacy of Queen Victoria's century. She buys up all the eyesores facing her shore and lets them fall. The season's ill. We've lost our summer millionaire, who seemed to leap from an L.L. Bean catalog. His 9-knot yawl was auctioned off to lobstermen. A red fox strain covers Blue Hill. A red fox stain covers Blue Hill. And now our fairy decorator brightens his shop for fall, his fishnets filled with orange cork, orange his cobbler's bench and all. There is no money in his work. He'd rather marry. One dark night, my Tudor Ford climbed the hill's skull. I watched for love cars, lights turned down. They lay together, hull to hull, where the graveyard shelves on the town. My mind's not right. A car radio bleats, love, oh careless love. I hear my ill spirit sob in each blood cell, as if my hand were at its throat. I myself am hell. Nobody's here. Only skunks that search in the moonlight for a bite to eat. They march on their souls up Main Street, white stripes, moonstruck eyes, red fire under the chalk dry and spar spire of the Trinitarian Church. I stand on top of our back steps and breathe the rich air. A mother skunk with her column of kittens swills the garbage pail. She jabs her wedge head in a cup of sour cream, drops her ostrich tail, and will not scare. This is a poem of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stanzas. Each stanza is 6 lines long, and when you listen to it, it sounds mostly like free verse, though if you caught it, there is a semi-regular rhyme scheme. Often we have rhyming line endings, usually separated by a line or two. So if we look at Spartan cottage is the end of the second line of the first stanza, and then the last line ends with the word dotage. So dotage and cottage are echoing each other. They're a couple lines away. But then you get, in the second stanza, she buys up all the eyesores facing her shore and lets them fall. All and fall is a more exact rhyme, and they're a little closer to each other. Eyesores facing her shore, sore and shore rhyme, that's an internal rhyme in the penultimate line of the second stanza. You have yawl and hill and ill, which are echoing each other. In the third stanza, you have fire and spire in a rhyming couplet. In the second to last stanza, white stripes, moonstruck eyes, red fire under the chalk dry and spire of the Trinitarian Church. Those two lines before of the Trinitarian Church feel very dense with sound. So even though Robert Lowell is writing in free verse, mostly here, you don't have strict iambic pentameter, you don't have even line lengths, you still do have regular attention to rhythms, to sounds of words, both in assonance and consonants, both alliteration with vowels and consonants. And you also have a basic 6-line structure. What's going on in this poem, though, in its content? Well, the first 4 stanzas are kind of giving a portrait of a gentrified and aging aristocratic town. We have the hermit heiress who lives in her Spartan cottage. We have the summer millionaire who looks like he jumped from an LL Bean catalog. We have fairy decorators. We have fishnet marquees that are showing off new, fall accoutrements to buy. This is kind of a rich, aristocratic seaside scene. And if it was just this, it would feel a lot like other things Lowell had written. Lowell was from what we would call the New England Brahmin society, the creme de la creme. They had money. The Lowell family had its aristocratic heritage way back into the 19th century. James Russell Lowell was a great poet of the mid-19th century, and probably one of the most famous poets of that era, in that era, friends with people like Emerson, Thoreau, Longfellow. So Robert Lowell inherited this very, we might say, kind of hoity-toity ancestry, and you can see him struggling with it. You can see him talking about those aspects of New England aristocracy that are not so pretty, buying up houses, kind of coming in for a season, spending lots of money, and then leaving the economy kind of destitute or dried up. But halfway through the poem, Lowell stops his portrait of an aging century and gives us a portrait of an aging self. And this is where we get some of Lowell's most famous lines. My mind's not right. Myself am hell. Nobody's here. Most have read this as Lowell being more honest than he'd ever been in his poetry. And he'd written several successful poetry collections before this. He's being honest about his struggles with mental health. And just, even if it's not, diagnosable mental health, this is a man who's in middle age, who's feeling the weight of middle age. This is a midlife crisis poem of a kind of mundane and desperate variety. We think of that line from Thoreau, that men lead lives of quiet desperation. I think this is a poem of quiet desperation. He's not, running off and, finding a new wife. He's not, moving to Barbados and, getting into gambling. He's just going out on his back porch, walking down the road, looking at love cars. I think that love cars is probably a reference to, the younger generation who are off, canoodling in their Camaros, listening to rock and roll. This is, after all, the mid-20th century. But Lowell is feeling his age. He's not off gallivanting with a girlfriend or, going to the drive-in. He's too old for that. We know that within Lowell's biography, he's married by this time and has started a family and is supremely unhappy. This will lead later, in about a decade or so, to a very messy public divorce, which he will write about and get some flack for writing about. But here, he's just walking around seeing a world that he feels out of place with. You have this final image of the skunk, which is so interesting. A very suburban animal, but a very unwanted and disturbing animal. And this is a skunk that is domesticated enough that it will not scare. Is the skunk an image of Lowell's own inability to get rid of that kind of stinking regular thing within himself? Think about it. There's a lot going on in this poem. It's worth spending time with. So one more really cool thing about this poem is that, as modern as it is, as mid-20th century as it is quoting several times from Paradise Lost and alluding to that older English tradition. This is especially discernible where he says, myself am hell. This comes from Satan's speech in Paradise Lost, where he says, which way I fly is hell, myself am hell. Satan is kind of saying, look, I've flown out of hell. He's exploring the universe that God has created after he fell. And he's kind of saying, look, I kind of carry hell with me, within me. And so wherever I go is hell, because I am it. This is a pretty big statement for a 20th century agnostic poet to say, this association of oneself with Satan. In writing a poem like this, Lowell set the stage for people like Sylvia Plath, who came after him. And yet his perspective on contrasting his own self-trouble with the trouble of a kind of rotting aristocracy would make a mark on American poetry that was not soon forgotten. Thanks.